People like her should learn to stay invisible. Evelyn Whitmore's voice cut through the ballroom like cold glass, drawing quiet laughter from the wealthy guests gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Naomi Carter kept her eyes lowered as she carried a silver tray between tables covered in white roses and half-finished champagne glasses. Outside the massive windows overlooking the Atlantic coast, rain hammered against the glass in thick gray sheets, and distant thunder rolled across the dark sky. The storm had already knocked out power across half the county, but inside the Whitmore mansion, backup generators kept the music playing and the wine flowing. Naomi moved silently through the room, her black uniform pressed neatly despite the 16-hour shift already weighing on her shoulders. She had learned long ago that silence made rich people comfortable. They liked workers who blended into walls, workers who nodded, workers who never looked them in the eye. Naomi, a sharp voice snapped from across the room. Evelyn stood near the grand staircase in a navy silk gown that shimmered under the chandelier light. Clean the spill near the piano before someone slips. Naomi walked quickly toward the marble floor where a guest had spilled bourbon beside the baby grand piano. As she knelt to wipe the amber liquid with a towel, two men nearby continued talking as though she wasn't even human. I swear, one of them muttered with a laugh. These people are replaceable every 2 weeks. Naomi's hand tightened slightly around the cloth, but her face never changed. She kept wiping the floor until it reflected the chandelier light again like calm water. Across the room, 16-year-old Claire Whitmore stood near the fireplace scrolling on her phone, barely touching the food on her plate. Naomi noticed it immediately. Pale skin, shallow breathing, slight tremor in the fingers, tiny details nobody else seemed to see. Naomi glanced longer than she should have. Claire suddenly pressed a hand against her chest. Then came another flash of lightning outside, so bright it turned the ballroom white for half a second. The lights flickered once, twice, then the entire mansion dropped into darkness. A wave of startled voices swept through the room. Someone laughed nervously. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered against the floor. Emergency backup lights finally clicked on, bathing the ballroom in a dim red glow that made every face look colder. Naomi looked toward Claire again. The girl swayed beside the fireplace. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the marble floor with a crack. Then her body collapsed. Guests screamed. Chairs scraped violently across the floor. Evelyn froze near the staircase as her daughter lay motionless beneath the red emergency lights. Claire, Daniel Whitmore rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside his sister. Claire, wake up. Naomi moved instantly. Years of buried training woke inside her like muscle memory. She's not breathing right, Naomi said firmly as she reached the girl's side. But before she could kneel beside Claire, a tall man in a gray tuxedo stepped in front of her and shoved a hand toward her shoulder. Back off, he snapped. You're the maid. Naomi stared past him at Claire's blue-tinted lips as thunder shook the mansion again. Then she realized something horrifying. The storm had blocked the coastal highway nearly 20 miles back. No ambulance would reach them in time. The ballroom filled with noise so quickly that it almost sounded unreal. Crystal glasses rattled across tables as guests crowded around Claire Whitmore, their expensive shoes scraping against the marble floor in nervous confusion. Some shouted for help, while others stood frozen beneath the dim emergency lights, staring at the teenage girl lying motionless beside the fireplace. Rain continued slamming against the giant windows overlooking the ocean cliffs, and every few seconds lightning flashed across the dark water outside, turning the room white before plunging it back into deep red shadows. Naomi stepped forward again, breathing steadily despite the panic rising around her. She needs air now, she said firmly. Move back and give her space. But nobody listened. A woman wearing diamonds around her neck pulled her husband farther away from Naomi, as if simply standing too close to her made them uncomfortable. The tall man in the gray tuxedo still blocked Naomi's path. Did you not hear me? He snapped. You are staff. Stay out of this. Naomi looked at Claire's chest. The breaths were becoming weaker now. Small, uneven, dangerous. Daniel Whitmore held his sister's hand with trembling fingers. Somebody call 911, he shouted. A guest near the bar lifted his phone helplessly. No signal. Another man rushed toward the kitchen entrance. The landlines are dead too. Thunder cracked overhead hard enough to shake the chandelier. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, The backup generator groaned loudly before stabilizing again. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She knew exactly what was happening to Claire. She had seen it once before during her clinical training years ago at Mercy General Hospital in Baltimore. Severe allergic shock. The body slowly shutting itself down while everybody wasted precious minutes arguing. Naomi moved around the man blocking her before he could stop her again. She dropped to her knees beside Claire and gently tilted the girl's head to open her airway. "What did she eat?" Naomi asked. Nobody answered. Evelyn finally stepped forward from the staircase, her face pale beneath perfect makeup. "What are you doing?" she demanded sharply. Naomi did not look up. "Trying to help your daughter breathe." Evelyn's jaw tightened immediately at the tone. Rich people in rooms like this were used to obedience, not confidence. Especially not from someone like Naomi. "We are waiting for professionals," Evelyn said coldly. Naomi finally looked directly at her for the first time that night. By the time they get here, it could be too late. Silence spread across the ballroom after those words. Even the guests stopped whispering. Another weak breath escaped Claire's lips. Daniel looked between Naomi and his mother, uncertainty pulling across his face. "Mom." Evelyn folded her arms tightly. "She cleans this house," she said quietly, almost offended by the situation itself. "She is not a doctor." Naomi swallowed hard. The old humiliation felt familiar. Heavy. Exhausting. But Claire's fingers had already started turning cold in her hands. Naomi leaned closer, listening carefully to the shallow breathing. Then she saw it. A tiny silver medical bracelet hidden beneath Claire's sleeve. Severe peanut allergy. Naomi's eyes widened instantly. She looked toward the dessert table across the ballroom, where half-eaten chocolate pastries sat beneath golden serving trays. One of the pastries had crushed peanut pieces baked into the top. Naomi stood so suddenly the guests stepped back in surprise. "Does anyone here have an EpiPen?" she asked loudly. Nobody answered. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Then the mansion lights flickered again, and this time the generator did not immediately recover. Darkness rolled through the Whitmore mansion like a living thing. For one long second, the ballroom disappeared completely, swallowing the wealthy guests into silence broken only by the sound of rain crashing against the windows and waves pounding the cliffs below the estate. Then a few emergency floor lights flickered weakly near the hallways, casting thin strips of pale light across the marble floor. Claire Whitmore's breathing had become shallow and uneven now, each breath weaker than the last. Daniel knelt beside his sister helplessly, his expensive suit soaked with spilled champagne and sweat. "Claire," he whispered desperately, brushing damp hair away from her face. "Stay with me." Naomi turned toward the kitchen entrance. Her heartbeat pounded hard, but her voice remained steady. "There has to be an emergency medical kit somewhere in this house." Nobody moved. Guests stood frozen in clusters, staring at Naomi as if they still could not decide whether to trust her or ignore her. Evelyn Whitmore wrapped her arms tightly around herself beneath the dim red lights. Even now, fear could not fully hide the pride in her face. "The staff handles medical supplies," she said coldly. "I do not know where they keep them." Naomi looked at her for a moment, surprised by how small those words sounded in a room this large. A billionaire surrounded by senators, investors, and lawyers, yet completely powerless beside her own daughter. Another sharp breath escaped Claire's throat. Naomi immediately leaned down beside her again, checking her pulse with trembling fingers. Still there. Fading, but there. "Daniel," Naomi said quickly. "Help me lift her shoulders slightly." Daniel obeyed without hesitation this time. Together they adjusted Claire carefully against the polished marble floor while thunder rattled the windows overhead. Naomi scanned the room rapidly. Then she saw it. A small silver cabinet mounted beside the bar near the dining hall entrance. Emergency supplies. She stood instantly and hurried across the ballroom. Her shoes echoed sharply against the marble as the guests parted out of her way. The cabinet was locked electronically, dead because of the outage. Naomi grabbed a heavy candle holder from a nearby table and struck the cabinet once. The glass cracked loudly. Several guests gasped in shock. Naomi ignored them. She reached inside quickly, pulling out gauze, gloves, a flashlight, and finally a small red emergency injector case. Relief flooded through her chest. She hurried back toward Claire while the storm roared outside like an angry ocean. "What are you doing?" the man in the gray tuxedo demanded again. Naomi did not stop walking, saving her life. She dropped beside Claire and opened the injector case with careful hands. Daniel stared at her. How do you know how to do this? Naomi hesitated only a second. The memory hit her suddenly. Baltimore. White hospital hallways. Overnight nursing shifts. Her instructor smiling proudly after a successful emergency simulation. Then her mother getting sick. Bills stacking higher every month. Dreams quietly abandoned one payment at a time. Naomi pushed the memory aside and focused on Claire. I used to study emergency medicine, she said softly. The room fell strangely quiet after those words. Even Evelyn looked stunned for the first time all night. Naomi administered the injector carefully and kept her eyes on Claire's face. Seconds passed. Rain battered the windows harder. Somewhere upstairs, the backup generator finally failed completely, and the mansion sank once again into near-total darkness. Then Claire suddenly pulled in a rough breath. Daniel stared at his sister in disbelief. A few guests gasped softly. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief moment, relief washing through her like warmth after cold rain. But when she opened them again, she noticed something else. Claire was still struggling. The allergic reaction had slowed, but it was not over. And now the storm outside was getting worse. The storm swallowed the coastline completely now. From inside the Whitmore mansion, the ocean beyond the glass windows looked like black moving shadows beneath flashes of white lightning. Rainwater streamed down the towering panes in thick rivers, blurring the world outside until it barely looked real anymore. Inside the ballroom, the air had changed. The expensive laughter was gone. The confidence was gone too. Wealth meant nothing in darkness. Naomi stayed beside Claire on the marble floor, carefully monitoring every breath while the weak emergency lights flickered along the hallways. Claire had regained some color, but her chest still tightened with every inhale. It was not enough. Naomi knew the reaction could return stronger at any moment. Daniel crouched beside his sister, his voice low and strained. What else does she need? Naomi glanced around the room quickly. Oxygen would help. Fluids too. We need to keep her breathing steady until emergency crews arrive. One of the guests let out a nervous laugh. Emergency crews are not coming up that cliff road tonight. Silence followed his words immediately. Everyone knew he was right. The storm had already flooded sections of the coastal highway 20 miles south. The Whitmore estate sat isolated on the cliffs like a glass island above the ocean. Evelyn stood near the fireplace with her arms folded tightly across her chest, but Naomi noticed the change in her eyes now. Fear had replaced control. For the first time all evening, the powerful woman looked helpless. Naomi stood carefully and looked toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the mansion. There is a medical room somewhere in this house, she said. Evelyn hesitated before answering quietly. Second floor, near Richard's office. Naomi nodded once and immediately headed toward the staircase. Wait, the man in the gray tuxedo snapped again. You cannot just wander around this house. Naomi stopped halfway up the stairs and slowly turned back toward him. Red emergency light cut across her face while thunder rolled overhead. Then you go find the supplies, she said calmly. The man said nothing. Naomi continued upstairs. The mansion felt colder away from the ballroom. Without power, the long hallways stretched into darkness broken only by occasional lightning flashing through tall windows overlooking the sea. Her shoes moved quickly across polished wood floors while the storm groaned outside like something alive. Naomi reached the second floor and pushed open doors one by one until she finally found the medical room hidden behind Richard Whitmore's private office. Shelves lined the walls with supplies most families would never afford. Portable oxygen tanks, monitoring equipment, emergency medications. Naomi exhaled sharply in relief and grabbed everything she could carry. As she turned back toward the hallway, another violent crack of thunder shook the mansion hard enough to rattle framed paintings from the walls. Then the lights died completely again. Total darkness. Naomi froze for one breath. Somewhere downstairs, she heard distant screaming. Then she heard Daniel shouting her name. Naomi tightened her grip on the oxygen tank and forced herself forward through the darkness. Lightning flashed through the hallway windows every few seconds, briefly revealing the path ahead in pale blue light before vanishing again. She moved carefully down the staircase while shadows shifted across the walls around her. When Naomi finally returned to the ballroom, The scene waiting below made her stop cold. Several guests were trying to leave through the front entrance despite the storm. The heavy doors had blown partially open from the wind, and rain sprayed violently across the marble floor. In the middle of the chaos, Claire suddenly stopped breathing again. Everything inside the ballroom shattered into panic again. Guests backed away from Claire Whitmore as though fear itself had become contagious. Rain blew violently through the partially opened front doors, carrying cold ocean wind across the marble floors and extinguishing half the candles in the room. The remaining light flickered weakly against crystal glasses and terrified faces. Daniel dropped beside his sister immediately. "Claire." His voice cracked this time. Naomi rushed forward, carrying the oxygen tank against her chest. "Move," she said sharply. There was no hesitation in her voice anymore. The guests finally stepped aside. Even the man in the gray tuxedo said nothing now. Naomi knelt beside Claire and quickly attached the oxygen mask with steady hands despite the storm shaking the mansion around them. Claire's breathing came in weak, uneven gasps beneath the mask. Naomi checked her pulse again. Too fast. Too unstable. She looked toward Daniel. "I need blankets. Warm ones. Now." Daniel stood instantly and disappeared into the dark hallway without questioning her. Evelyn remained frozen near the fireplace, staring at her daughter beneath the flashing lightning outside the windows. Naomi could feel the woman watching her now with a completely different expression. Not superiority, not anger, fear, pure fear. Another crash of thunder shook the glass walls. Somewhere upstairs, a loud cracking sound echoed through the mansion. Guests screamed again as the lights flickered one more time before fading almost completely. Only lightning illuminated the room now in sharp bursts of silver and blue. Naomi adjusted the oxygen flow carefully while counting Claire's breaths under her own breath. "Come on," she whispered softly. "Stay with me." Claire's fingers twitched weakly against the marble floor. A small sign, but enough to keep Naomi focused. Daniel returned carrying thick blankets from upstairs. Together they wrapped Claire carefully while cold rainwater crept farther across the ballroom floor from the open entrance. Naomi looked toward the doors. Wind howled through the opening hard enough to shake nearby tables. "The doors need to be shut," she said. Several guests avoided eye contact immediately. Nobody wanted to go near the storm. Naomi started to rise, but Claire suddenly coughed hard beneath the oxygen mask. Naomi immediately dropped back beside her. "Daniel," she said quickly, "close the doors." He nodded and ran toward the entrance with two other men finally following behind him. Naomi stayed beside Claire alone while the ballroom continued trembling under the storm. Then Evelyn slowly walked closer. Her high heels clicked softly against the marble until she stopped only a few feet away from Naomi. For several seconds, the billionaire woman simply stared down at the maid she had humiliated earlier that same night. Naomi kept her attention on Claire. "Will she survive?" Evelyn asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. Honest answers mattered more than comfort now. "I do not know yet." The words hit Evelyn harder than shouting ever could. Her face tightened as she looked at her daughter struggling beneath the oxygen mask. Naomi noticed something strange then. Evelyn's hands were shaking. Tiny movements. Barely visible. Human. For the first time all night, she did not look powerful at all. Another lightning flash illuminated the ballroom. In that brief burst of white light, Naomi noticed framed family photographs lining the wall near the staircase. Vacations in Europe. Graduation ceremonies. Smiling faces on yachts beneath summer sunlight. A perfect family frozen inside expensive silver frames. Naomi looked back down at Claire's pale face and felt a sudden ache deep inside her chest. Because despite everything that had happened tonight, she still did not want this family to lose their daughter. Then Claire suddenly opened her eyes halfway. Daniel rushed back toward her immediately. "Claire," he whispered desperately. Her lips moved weakly beneath the oxygen mask. Naomi leaned closer to hear her. Claire barely managed a whisper. "Mom." Evelyn dropped to her knees beside her daughter without caring that the marble floor soaked her gown with rainwater. And in the middle of the storm, surrounded by darkness and silence, Naomi realized something had quietly changed inside that room forever. The storm finally began to drift farther out over the ocean just after midnight, but the Whitmore mansion remained wrapped in darkness and silence. Rain still tapped softly against the towering windows now, gentler than before, like tired fingers against glass. Most of the guests had gathered quietly near the far side of the ballroom, wrapped in blankets and expensive coats, speaking in hushed voices that no longer carried arrogance. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody looked at Naomi the same way either. Claire rested beneath layers of blankets beside the fireplace, her breathing finally steady beneath the oxygen mask. Daniel sat close beside her with one hand protectively resting near her shoulder, his face pale from exhaustion. Across the room, Evelyn stood alone near the dark piano where Naomi had cleaned spilled bourbon only hours earlier. The billionaire stared silently at her own reflection in the black window glass, while distant lightning flickered weakly over the ocean horizon. Naomi adjusted the oxygen tank carefully before sitting back against the marble floor for the first time all night. Her arms ached. Her knees hurt from hours on the cold stone. The muscles in her back burned beneath her uniform, but she ignored it. She had learned years ago that tired people still had responsibilities. A soft crackling sound came from the fireplace nearby. Warm orange light flickered gently across Claire's face now, replacing the harsh emergency glow from earlier. Naomi watched the firelight move across the room and suddenly remembered another winter night long ago in Baltimore. A tiny apartment, snow against thin windows. Her mother asleep on the couch beneath old blankets while Naomi studied anatomy textbooks beside a flickering space heater because they could not afford proper heat. She remembered dreaming about hospital hallways back then. Clean white shoes, long overnight shifts, saving people, becoming someone the world respected. Then came the medical bills, the second job, the dropped classes, one quiet sacrifice after another until the dream disappeared without anyone noticing. Naomi lowered her eyes toward her hands resting in her lap now. Small scars crossed her knuckles from years of cleaning chemicals and hard work. Hands people barely saw unless they needed something carried away. Across the ballroom, Evelyn slowly turned toward her. Their eyes met for only a second before Evelyn looked down at the soaked marble floor. Shame sat visibly across her face now, heavy and impossible to hide. Naomi expected another cold comment, another order. Instead, Evelyn walked silently across the ballroom and placed a thick wool blanket beside Naomi without speaking. For a moment, neither woman moved. Rain whispered softly against the glass walls around them while the fire crackled nearby. Naomi looked at the blanket, then slowly up at Evelyn again. The older woman's voice came out quieter than Naomi had ever heard before. You stayed. Naomi frowned slightly. Claire needed help. Evelyn swallowed hard, her eyes drifting toward her sleeping daughter. Most people would have left after the way we treated you. Naomi looked toward the dark ocean outside the windows. Somewhere beyond the storm, ambulance lights were probably still fighting their way up flooded roads toward the estate. Maybe, Naomi answered softly. But leaving people behind never felt right to me. The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Evelyn looked at Naomi for a long moment, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since she had walked into the mansion months ago, wearing a Maid uniform and carrying cleaning supplies. Not invisible anymore. Not replaceable. Just human. Near the fireplace, Claire shifted weakly beneath the blankets and opened her eyes halfway again. Her gaze landed on Naomi immediately. Even exhausted, the teenager managed the faintest whisper. Thank you. Naomi smiled softly for the first time all night. Outside, the storm clouds slowly began breaking apart over the Atlantic, and pale moonlight finally touched the mansion windows again. By 3 a.m, the storm had weakened enough for distant emergency sirens to finally echo somewhere beyond the cliffs. The sound rolled faintly through the damp ocean air like a promise slowly fighting its way closer. Inside the mansion, exhaustion settled over everyone like heavy fog. Guests who once filled the ballroom with loud conversations and expensive laughter now sat quietly beneath blankets with tired eyes and pale faces. Claire slept peacefully beside the fireplace while the oxygen tank hummed softly beside her. Naomi remained awake near the hearth, watching the slow rise and fall of Claire's breathing. She trusted the calm only halfway. Medical emergencies could turn in seconds. Daniel stepped quietly across the ballroom, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one carefully to Naomi. It is probably terrible, he admitted. The kitchen staff left hours ago. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm mug, surprised by the gesture more than the drink itself. Thank you. Daniel sat nearby and stared into the fireplace for a moment before speaking again. My mother said you worked here almost 8 months. Naomi nodded once. Since last fall. Daniel shook his head slowly. And somehow tonight is the first real conversation anybody has had with you. Naomi did not answer immediately. The firelight reflected softly across the dark polished floor between them. People usually talk around me, she finally said quietly. Not to me. Daniel lowered his eyes at those words. Across the room, Evelyn stood alone near the staircase, speaking softly on a satellite phone finally brought online by emergency crews outside. Her posture looked different now. Smaller somehow. Less untouchable. Naomi took a slow sip of coffee before glancing toward the family photographs lining the ballroom walls again. Claire is strong, she said softly. She responded fast once the medication worked. Daniel nodded. You saved her. Naomi looked back toward the fire instead of answering. Footsteps echoed suddenly from the front hallway as 2 paramedics finally entered the mansion carrying equipment cases soaked from rainwater. Several guests stood quickly in relief. The older paramedic hurried toward Claire and immediately began checking monitors and oxygen levels while the younger one asked questions. Who administered the epinephrine injector? Naomi raised her hand slightly. The paramedic looked surprised. Are you medically trained? Before Naomi could answer, Daniel spoke first. She kept my sister alive for hours. The paramedic glanced toward Naomi again with new respect in his eyes. Well, he said quietly, checking Claire's pulse monitor. Whoever you are, you absolutely saved this girl's life tonight. The ballroom fell silent again after those words. Naomi noticed several guests suddenly unable to meet her eyes. The man in the gray tuxedo slowly looked away first. Evelyn stood completely still near the staircase, staring at Naomi across the room while rainwater dripped softly from the paramedics' jackets onto the marble floor. Then the younger paramedic looked toward Naomi once more. What hospital did you train at? Naomi hesitated. Old embarrassment tightened quietly in her chest again. Mercy General in Baltimore, she answered softly. The older paramedic immediately looked up from Claire's monitor. Mercy. He sounded genuinely impressed now. That emergency program is one of the hardest in the state. Daniel slowly turned toward Naomi. You never finished? Naomi stared into the firelight flickering across her coffee cup. My mother got sick during my 2nd year, she said quietly. I needed money more than classes. Nobody spoke after that. Not because they did not understand her words, but because suddenly every person inside that mansion understood exactly what they had missed all along. The woman they treated like background noise had once stood inches away from becoming the very professional they desperately needed tonight. Outside, the first ambulance lights finally reflected across the wet mansion windows, flashing red and white against the dark Atlantic sky. Morning arrived slowly over the Atlantic coast, soft gray sunlight spilling across the wet cliffs and shattered storm clouds beyond the Whitmore estate. The mansion looked different in daylight. Smaller somehow. The giant windows that once reflected wealth and perfection now carried streaks of dried rainwater and salt from the storm. Emergency vehicles lined the circular driveway outside while exhausted guests quietly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Nobody carried the same confidence they had arrived with the night before. Inside the ballroom, workers moved silently through overturned chairs, damp carpets, and abandoned champagne glasses. Naomi stood near the kitchen entrance holding a trash bag filled with soaked table linens. She had changed back into her normal routine without being asked. That was what years of service taught. People survive the storm, then clean up after it. Claire had been transferred safely to the hospital shortly after sunrise. Daniel had left with her in the ambulance nearly an hour earlier. Evelyn remained inside the mansion alone. Naomi carried the heavy bag toward the service hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. Naomi. She turned slowly. Evelyn Whitmore stood near the ballroom entrance wearing a simple cream-colored sweater instead of the expensive gowns and jewelry from the night before. Without makeup and surrounded by morning light, she looked older, tired, human. Naomi waited quietly. Evelyn glanced down at the trash bag in Naomi's hands, and for the first time since they met, embarrassment crossed her face openly. You should not be cleaning today, she said softly. Naomi gave a small shrug. Somebody has to. The words landed harder than Naomi intended. Evelyn looked away briefly before speaking again. Would you walk with me? Naomi hesitated, surprised by the request, but eventually nodded. Together, they walked silently through the long hallway overlooking the ocean. Sunlight reflected across the polished floors while waves crashed softly far below the cliffs outside. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn stopped near a tall window, facing the sea. "I spent years believing success meant being untouchable," she said quietly. "Control, status, power." Naomi remained still beside her. Evelyn swallowed hard before continuing. "Last night my daughter almost died while I stood there completely useless." Her voice cracked slightly on the final word. "And the person who saved her was the same woman I treated like she did not matter." Naomi looked out toward the ocean instead of answering. The silence between them no longer felt cold now, just honest. Evelyn slowly reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a folded envelope. "I spoke to Mercy General this morning," she said. Naomi blinked in confusion. Evelyn handed her the envelope carefully. "Your academic records were still active." Naomi stared at the papers inside. Reinstatement forms, tuition approval, housing assistance. Her hands trembled slightly against the crisp pages. "I do not understand," she whispered. Evelyn finally looked directly at her. "You were never meant to spend your life carrying trays through rooms full of people who cannot see you." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the envelope again, overwhelmed by emotions she could not fully name. Gratitude, shock, pain for all the lost years. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I cannot erase the way I treated you," she said quietly. "But I would like to stop being the person who caused that pain." Naomi stood silent for a long moment while sunlight warmed the ocean beyond the glass. Then she carefully folded the papers against her chest and nodded once. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just real. Evelyn's eyes filled softly with emotion she no longer tried to hide. Down the hallway, one of the housekeeping staff passed by carrying cleaning supplies and paused in surprise at the sight of the two women standing together in silence beside the morning light. 6 months later, winter sunlight poured softly across the glass entrance of St. and Medical Center in downtown Baltimore. Snow from the night before still rested along the sidewalks and parked cars, turning the city streets pale beneath the early morning light. Inside the hospital, nurses moved quickly through bright hallways carrying clipboards and cups of coffee, while overhead speakers quietly announced shift changes across different departments. Naomi Carter walked steadily through the corridor wearing dark blue scrubs beneath a clean white trainee jacket. A small identification badge rested against her chest, swinging gently with each step she took. She still moved quietly the way she had inside the Whitmore mansion, but now people looked directly at her when they spoke. Some smiled. Some nodded respectfully as they passed. "Morning, Naomi," one of the nurses called warmly from the front desk. Naomi smiled back softly. "Morning." The sound still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Respect usually arrived slowly for people like her. She stopped outside room 214 and carefully reviewed patient notes beneath the warm glow of hallway lights. Her hands looked different now. Stronger. Steadier. The old cleaning scars remained across her knuckles, but they no longer defined what those hands were capable of doing. A nearby television mounted above the waiting area quietly played a local news segment about winter storm preparedness along the East Coast. Naomi barely noticed it as she stepped into the patient room, carrying medications and fresh water. The elderly woman inside smiled immediately when she saw her. "You always remember the extra ice," the patient said softly. Naomi adjusted the blanket around the woman's shoulders before handing her the cup. "My grandmother liked extra ice too," she answered gently. Outside the room, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Naomi turned and froze slightly when she saw Daniel Whitmore approaching beside Claire. Claire looked healthy again now, wrapped in a cream-colored coat with color returned fully to her face. Daniel smiled first. "We hoped you were on shift today." Naomi blinked in surprise. "Claire." The teenager stepped forward and hugged her carefully without hesitation. "I got accepted into Georgetown yesterday," Claire said excitedly. "I wanted you to know first." Naomi laughed softly, emotion catching her by surprise. "That is incredible."